Hello again and welcome to another episode of Science Corner with Constantine. Constantine is me. Here I am, living that YouTube star life, creating content for the people. I mean, video lessons are fun, but Alright, so today I have a full-on lesson about natural selection, what it is and how it works. It does feature candy. I'm sorry you can't eat it. I cannot give you the candy through the screen, but if you want to follow along with your own candy, you do that. Remember to follow along with your guided notes. I miss you guys.
Alright team, so welcome to our lesson about evolution, natural selection, all of the vocab that goes with it. Follow along with your guided notes. So in order to talk about evolution, we have to bring up our friend Charles Darwin with the beautiful beard and all that he did. He's a British natural scientist and he developed the theory of evolution by natural selection. And when we say theory, a theory is not just a guess. A theory is a scientific explanation based on evidence. It's not a guess. A theory is a real thing that required a lot of research to develop. Darwin's theory of evolution is based around the concept of natural selection. At its core, natural selection is the process by which organisms that are better suited to the environment, so organisms that have good traits, survive to produce more offspring or have more babies. And then those babies have good traits that eventually the entire population ends up with. So it's a very cool thing, and I'm going to explain more about it now. Alright, so here is a fake population of jelly beans. They are all different colors and they are living on an environment of orange paper. So as you can see, some of the jelly beans blend better in with their orange background, so the orange jelly beans are not quite as easy to see, and the other colors are a little bit easier to see. So let's pretend that I am a predator in this environment. I'm going to randomly take a few jelly beans to eat. So it looks like the jelly beans that survived were a mix of different colors. But now the survivors are going to reproduce. So I'm adding a jelly bean next to each jelly bean to represent it having a little baby jelly bean. So now the predator is going to come back and eat another random sample of jelly beans. Now the survivors are going to reproduce to have another generation of baby jelly beans. And now the predator is coming back to take another random sampling of jelly beans. Remember, this predator is taking the jelly beans that she can see the best. Now the individual jelly beans are going to reproduce and have baby jelly beans one more time. So now if you look at the population of jelly beans that we're left with, it doesn't look quite the same as the population we started out with. There's one color that's a lot more dominant over the other ones, and that's orange. Because remember, this predator couldn't see orange as well as she could see the other jelly beans because the background was orange. If we were to keep doing this over more generations, what do you think that this population of jelly beans would look like? So I'm going to draw out another example, and this one is using tiny little bob-like stick figures. So here's a stick figure population. There's some variation. Some are different colors, some have longer legs, some have shorter legs, some have squiggly legs. So there is a predator in this environment that the tiny little bug people have to deal with. So if you look at the variation that they have within their population, one of these little creatures has an advantageous trait. He has something that's going to make him better at surviving. Oh, and there's the cat. Excuse me, cat. Okay, so one of these little creatures has something that's going to make him better at surviving. That's his long legs. So out of those 4 creatures, it looks like one of them is going to escape and 3 of them are not. So the one that escapes is going to survive to reproduce, and his offspring and their offspring will likely have the long leg trait as well. and that's natural selection. So a lot of what natural selection comes down to is having good traits. We call these good traits adaptations. An adaptation is a characteristic that helps an organism survive and reproduce in its environment. There are two types of adaptations that we talk about. The first type is physical, which is an adaptation that you have on your body, versus behavioral, which is something that you do. So an example of a physical adaptation would be human thumbs. Humans have thumbs, and they make us better at surviving. But a behavioral adaptation is that we have the ability to make fire, which helped us cook our food and keep us warm, which helped us survive as well. So on your notes page right now, first I want you to write, what is the adaptation in our jelly bean experiment? What was the advantageous trait? And then give 3 examples of any adaptations of any living things. So pause if you need to and write those down in your notes. Some examples that you could give are scales on fish, or the shape of a fish to help it move through the water. Or you could say the thin round shape of a worm. Or you could even say wings on butterflies. Anything that helps an organism survive and reproduce. But how do these adaptations come about? Sometimes new adaptations come about by mutation, which is something you already know about. It's a change in the DNA code for an organism that can result in a new trait. This trait might be good and it might be bad. Either way, mutation leads to variation in a population. And variation is really important for natural selection because it means that some organisms are going to be better suited to the environment than others. I have a great example of a mutation, and it is my cat, Salem.
Look at his little feet.
So this is Salem. He has extra toes on each of his paws. So where normal cats have like 4 toes on top, he has about 6.
I love you. I love you. I love you. Thank you.
Thank you, Salem. Oh, bye-bye.
So do you think that Salem's mutation makes him better suited to the environment or not as well suited to the environment? Do you think it's an adaptation? Write about it in your notes. Another thing that we need to understand when we talk about evolution is the concept of a species. A species is a group of organisms that all have pretty similar characteristics and can mate with each other to produce fertile offspring. So, one example of a species are humans. Humans have the ability to mate with each other and produce fertile baby humans. Can a cat and a fish mate together to produce fertile offspring? Definitely not. So they're not the same species. The offspring have to be fertile. Oh, there's my cat again. A different cat this time. That is a different cat than before. Hi, Salem. So in order to be considered the same species, offspring have to be fertile. So an example that we can look at is a horse and a donkey. Horses and donkeys can reproduce together. But when they reproduce, what they give birth to is a mule. And a mule is not fertile. It can't have its own babies. So horses and donkeys aren't the same species. So now that we know what a species is and we know what natural selection is, we can look at evolution, which is change over time. So species develop and change over time through natural selection, and we call that evolution. So evolution is basically natural selection over a long period of time. It takes a long time for evolution to happen. So for an example of change over time, we are going to look at giraffes. If we see my very poorly drawn giraffes, we see that a long time ago, giraffes probably had different sized necks. Some were long, some were shorter, some were probably in the middle. So there was probably some variation in the neck size of the giraffe population. But over time, when you look at how giraffes like to get their food, giraffes that had the longer necks were probably the ones that survived to reproduce. So over time, those giraffes had babies, and eventually the entire giraffe population grew longer necks, just like we know giraffes to have today. So there's one more type of evolution that we're going to talk about, and that is evolution that is driven by humans. That's known as selective breeding. That's when humans choose which plants or animals to reproduce based on traits that they like. So it happens pretty much just like natural selection, except it's decided by humans, which is why we also call it artificial selection. There are a lot of examples of selective breeding in your everyday life, like the fruits that we eat or the pets that we have. So there you have it. Variation in a population leads to some organisms having advantageous traits or adaptations, and other organisms not having the adaptations. The ones that have the adaptations survive and reproduce and pass their traits on. And over time, it leads to a species changing. And that's evolution. Thank you, Charles Darwin. Do 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 do.
I know I say this every time, but if you want, you can like, you can subscribe, you can do whatever. You could check out other videos. I put some non-class videos up. They're pretty fun.